Tuesday 404 of reading Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix. Let's get started. We're currently on page 311. I've always thought Fred and I should have got eaten everything because we exceeded expectation just by turning up for the exams. They all laughed except for Hermione, who plowed on. So after E, it's A for acceptable. And that's the last pass grade, isn't it? Yup, said Fred, dunking an entire roll in his soup, transferring it to his mouth and swallowing it whole. Then you get P for poor. Ron raised both his arms in mock celebration, and D for dreadful. And then T, George reminded him. T? Said Hermione, looking appalled. Even lower than a D? What on earth does that stand for? Troll, said George promptly. Harry laughed again, though he was not sure whether or not George was joking. He had managed trying to conceal from Hermione that he had received T's in all his OWLs and immediately resolved to work harder from now on. You lot hadn't inspected lesson yet? Fred asked them. No, said Hermione at once. Have you? Just now, before lunch, said George. Charms. What was it like? Harry and Hermione asked together. Fred shrugged. Not that bad. Umbridge just lurked in a corner making notes on a clipboard. You know what Flitwick's like. He treated her like a guest. Didn't seem to bother him at all. She didn't say much. Asked Alicia a couple of questions about what the classes are normally like. Alicia told her that they were really good, and that was it. I can't see old Flitwick getting marked down, said George. He usually gets everyone through their exams all right. Who've you got this afternoon? Fred asked Harry. Trelawney? A T if I ever saw one, and Umbridge herself. And well, be a good boy and keep your temper with Umbridge today, said George. Angelina will do her nut if you miss any more Quidditch practices. Ayo. But Harry did not have to wait for Defense Against the Dark Arts to meet Professor Umbridge. He was pulling out his dream diary in a seat at the very back of the shadowy divination room when Ron elbowed him in the ribs and, looking round, he saw Professor Umbridge emerging through the trapdoor in the floor. The class, which had been talking cheerily, fell silent at once. The abrupt fall in the noise level made Professor Trelawney, who had been wafting about handing out dream oracles, look round. Good afternoon, Professor Trelawney, said Professor Umbridge with her wide smile. You received my note, I trust, giving the time and date of your inspection? Professor Trelawney nodded curtly and looked very disgruntled, turned her back on Professor Umbridge, and continued to give out books. Still smiling, Professor Umbridge grasped the back of the nearest armchair and pulled it to the front of the class so that it was a few inches behind Professor Trelawney's seat. She then sat down, took her clipboard from her flowery bag, and looked up expectantly, waiting for the class to begin. Professor Trelawney pulled her shawls tight about her with the slightly trembling hands and surveyed the class through her hugely magnifying lenses. We shall be continuing our study of prophetic dreams today, she said in a brave attempt at her usual mystic tones, though her voice shook slightly. Divide into pairs, please, and interpret each other's latest nighttime visions with the aid of the oracle. She made as though to sweep back to her seat, saw Professor Umbridge sitting right behind it, and immediately veered left toward Parvati and Lavender, who were already deep in discussion about Parvati's most recent dream. Harry opened his copy of the Dream Oracle, watching Umbridge covertly. She was making notes on her clipboard now. After a few minutes, she got to her feet and began to pace the room in Trelawney's wake, listening to her conversations with students and posing questions here and there. Harry bent his head hurriedly over his book. Think of a dream, quick, he told Ron, in case the old toad comes our way. I did it last time, Ron protested. It's your turn. You tell me one. Oh, I do know, said Harry desperately, who could not remember dreaming anything at all over the past few days. Let's say I dreamed I was drowning Snape in my cauldron. Yeah, that'll do. Ron chortled as he opened his dream oracle. Okay, we've got to add your age to the date you had the dream, then the number of letters in the subject. Would that be drowning or Cauldron, or Snape? It doesn't matter. Pick any of them, said Harry, chancing a glance behind him. Professor Umbridge was now standing at Professor Trelawney's shoulder, making notes while the divination teacher questioned Neville about his dream diary. What night did you dream this again? Ron said, immersed in calculations. I do know. Last night, whenever you like, Harry told him, trying to listen what Umbridge was saying to Professor Trelawney. They were only a table away from him and Ron now. Professor Trelawney was making another note on her clipboard, and Professor Trelawney was looking extremely put out. Now, said Umbridge, looking up at Trelawney, you've been in this post how long exactly? Professor Trelawney scowled at her, arms crossed and shoulders hunched as though wishing to protect herself as much as possible from the indignity of the inspection. After a slight pause in which she seemed to decide that the question was not so offensive that she could reasonably ignore it, she said in a deep, resentful tone, nearly 16 years. Quite a period, said Professor Umbridge, making a note on her clipboard. So is Professor Dumbledore who appointed you? That's right, said Professor Trelawney shortly. Professor Umbridge made another note. And you are a great-great-granddaughter of the celebrated Sir Cassandra Trelawney? Yes, said Professor Trelawney, holding her head a little higher. Another note on the clipboard. But I think, correct me if I am mistaken, that you are the first in your family since Cassandra to be possessed of second sight. These things often skip, 3 generations, said Professor Trelawney. Professor Umbridge's toad-like smile widened. Of course, she said sweetly, making yet another note. Well, if you could just predict something for me, then... She looked up inquiringly, still smiling. Professor Trelawney had stiffened as though unable to believe her ears. I don't understand you, said Professor Trelawney, clutching conclusively at the shawl around her scrawny neck. I'd like you to make a prediction for me, said Professor Umbridge very clearly. Harry and Ron were not the only people watching and listening sneakily from behind their books now. Most of the class were staring transfixed at Professor Trelawney as she drew herself up to her full height, her beads and bangles clinking. The inner eye does not see upon command, she said in scandalized tones. I see, said Professor Umbridge softly, making yet another note on her clipboard. But, wait, said Professor Trelawney suddenly, in an attempt at her usually ethereal voice, though the mystical effect was ruined somewhat by the way it was shaking with anger. I think I do see something that concerns you. Why, I said something dark, some great peril. Professor Trelawney pointed a shaking finger at Professor Umbridge, who continued to smile blandly at her, eyebrows raised. I am afraid that you are in grave danger, Professor Trelawney finished dramatically. There was a pause. Professor Umbridge surveyed Professor Trelawney. Right, she said softly, scribbling on her clipboard once more. Well, if that's really the best you can do. She turned away, leaving Professor Trelawney standing rooted to the spot, her chest heaving. Harry caught Ron's eye and knew that Ron was thinking exactly the same as he would. They both knew that Professor Trelawney was an old fraud, but on the other hand, they loathed Umbridge so much that they felt very much on Trelawney's side, until she swooped down on them a few seconds later. That was... Well, she said, snapping her long fingers under Harry's nose, uncharacteristically brisk. Let me see the start you've made on your dream diary, please. And by the time she had interpreted Harry's dreams at the top of her voice, all of which, even the ones involved eating porridge, apparently foretold a gruesome and early death, he was feeling much less sympathetic toward her. All the while, Professor Umbridge stood a few feet away, making notes on that clipboard, and when the bell rang, she descended the silver ladder first, so that she was waiting for them all when they reached their defense against the dark arts less than 10 minutes later. She was humming and smiling to herself when they entered the room. Harry and Ron told Hermione, who had been in Arthmancy, thank you everyone, that's all for today. Bye, see you tomorrow. Tomorrow we're going to read page 316. Bookmark, close. Peace out.